When it comes to modern renewables producing electricity, there's not a super long history. And there's really several different sources of renewables that people think about. You can talk about hydropower, you can talk about geothermal, you can talk about biomass, municipal solid waste, as well as wind and solar.
America's energy mix has changed a lot over the last decade, in particular in the electricity space. Coal a decade ago was more than 50% of our mix, and it's dropped down to 30%. Renewable energy, mainly wind and solar, have increased significantly. Wind is about 6.5 to 7, and then solar is just under 2%.
So it's a pretty small percentage, but what we're seeing is the year-on-year growth really increasing a lot to the point where renewables are beginning to become a much more significant part of the mix.
The U.S. has the most advanced energy economy in the world. We have a very sophisticated grid, we have very sophisticated power markets and power systems, very sophisticated electric utility infrastructure and system. All those things combine to give us the know-how to move forward to clean energy.
We've been kind of working at the edges of using renewables to produce energy in the U.S., starting with the space program where we had solar photovoltaic panels on satellites.
Both solar and wind started out as just very, very small resources, very small parts of the electricity system, in large part because they were new technologies, they were very expensive. But over the last several decades, that has really changed a lot.
Right now, the furthest along is wind power. The last couple of years, it's vied for either number 1 or number 2 as far as installed new capacity coming online. Solar is also growing very quickly. It doesn't quite have the base and hasn't had the history that wind has, but it is growing very quickly.
And now we're getting to a point where there's enough wind and enough solar in the electricity system that we're really looking forward to say, what might be possible? Can we reach an electricity system that is not just 5 or 10% renewable, but 50% or even 80% renewable?
Utilities have been very good at what they do. Our electrical grid and all the interconnections, the generators, the transmission lines, all the loads. It's described at times as the most complex machine in the world, and they're very good at keeping that system operating very reliably. Their grading scale, if you will, is how reliable it can be and how cheap they can make it. So when you come along and you say, I want to put some clean power, this wind and solar, it's a little more challenging on the system, their first reaction is, what does that mean for my grading scale? And can I keep it reliable, and can I keep it cost effective?
So when an electric power developer goes to look at, should we be investing in renewables like wind? Should we be investing in natural gas capacity? Should we be investing in new coal capacity? They need to think about what the cost of that power is relative to other power sources, because each of these power sources has to compete in the electricity market.
And just the change that's happened over the past few years on that is really amazing. I think the big story, though, is how much solar has dropped. And it's because of global competition. Manufacturing has gotten more efficient. We have companies all around the world wanting to enter the U.S. market. And it's just brought the price steadily down. It's dropped about 75% in the last couple of years.
But cost remains a challenge.
Renewable power tends to be significantly higher construction costs, but operating costs, which are basically zero because the wind is free, the sun shines down for free.
And I think one of the biggest challenges for us as an industry and as a society is to really be able to clearly articulate and understand what are all the costs of these resources, what are all the values they can provide, and how does that compare to the costs and values of conventional resources on the system.
Now we're starting to see some other things come up. Wind and solar are weather-driven fuel sources. They're not something that a utility operator can turn up or throw some more coal in the furnace and ramp up and down. It's driven by the weather.
And, that presents a problem for an electricity system that, to operate reliably, requires the instantaneous balance of electricity demand and electricity supply all the time. But there are a lot of ways to deal with that, and I think that one thing that's important to note is that grid operators have dealt with variability in the electricity system in one way or another forever. They don't control when we turn on the light switch or turn our air conditioner up.
They're used to dealing with a unpredictable demand. They do know how demand generally behaves, but they can't necessarily control when the electric demand pops on and off. Now we've got wind and solar coming on the system and more of it being deployed. It does increase their challenges. They have to figure out how to manage these increasingly weather-driven resources on their system.
To solve that, you need to be able to find a way that you can constantly provide reliable power. And the holy grail is storage technology.
If we had energy storage, we could store up a whole bunch of energy from the day when it was really sunny and the wind was really windy, and we'd have that energy to be able to use when it's not sunny and windy, and it would solve that problem for us.
It tends to be very challenging when it comes to costs, though. Storage is not cheap, so a lot of people say, oh, well, it'd be fine if we just had a lot of storage on the system, then the solar problem with the clouds and the intermittency and the fact that the sun doesn't shine at night would all go away. If we had widely deployed batteries, that's absolutely correct.
One option is you could pump water and pump it up into a big reservoir, and basically you're just filling up a lake, and when you need electricity you just let it drain out, run over a hydro system.
But we've built, at least in the United States, most of the dams that we are likely to build. We've captured the low-hanging fruit for hydropower.
There could be other sort of things like compressed air energy storage, where energy is pumped into caves and used that way.
You need to think about how do you move your conventional generators up and down.
Natural gas in particular has the benefit of being able to ramp up and ramp down when it's needed.
It's not something that takes a long time to warm up or needs to be planned for. You can very quickly put on a gas plant. And so when you have ebbs and flows of your availability of renewables, a gas plant could be a great complement.
And then the final step that really needs to be taken is to look for additional sources of flexibility that can manage and balance that variability from renewables. It can be things like demand response, which is really just shifting when we use electricity to better match when the wind is blowing or the sun is shining, and doing so in a way that really doesn't impede upon our comfort or experience in any way as consumers.
You could imagine a future where, with smart grids and better information from consumers to utilities about when energy is being consumed, putting together a portfolio that involves better matching minute to minute of demand.
But if we do get there, the sky's the limit. It's going to really rapidly enable wind and solar by solving the intermittency problem.
There are a variety of other things too. When we talk about central renewables, we have to think too about the infrastructure necessary to support those renewables.
Got to build transmission lines to get the power to where the people live and where the electric demand is centered.
Adding to the transmission grid that would be necessary is time-consuming and expensive enterprise, and it's particularly fraught with arguments about who should pay for these increments to the transmission grid that would be needed.
And that gating factor is not just predicated on price, but it's a chicken and egg. Will the generators come in and build their generators, hoping that if they get the generators out of the ground, it will create a market for transmission developers to come in? Will transmission developers do that in advance of generators already having their generators up? And so there's a lot of matching that has to go on.
So as renewables have begun to be built in the U.S. over the last several decades, a lot of that has been at the utility scale. We're beginning to see a shift in that towards more distributed renewables. And by that we mean particularly smaller scale renewable installations that are closer to where we as consumers use electricity. There's actually a lot of advantages to distributed renewables and distributed resources in general. And those are that they save a lot of energy by not having to move electricity over long transmission lines and losing a lot of it along the way. They can potentially really help improve the reliability and resilience of the grid. So we see a lot of potential for distributed renewables as consumers realize that they are actually capable of interacting with the electricity system and doing things themselves rather than just having to rely on the utility. While there are a few really exciting examples of how renewables are growing and being successfully integrated into the system in the US, overall, we're really not on track to reach an 80% or more renewable system by 2050, which is what we and many others think is necessary in order to meet many of our societal goals.
The timing of it is a big debate. A lot of people would like to see us get to higher penetrations of our electric supply coming from renewable resources, say. They'd like to see us get up to 50% very quickly. Realistically, the amount of installed capacity and the demand in this country is so large that we can't flip a switch and say we're going to have a renewable future in the next 2 years or the next 5 years. Even at the pace where we're installing more wind turbines than we ever have before every year, we can't go to a 50% renewable future in 2 years. It's just not possible.
But since the election, there's actually been a big shift to focus on this policy called the Green New Deal. That's basically a catch-all policy phrase to mean a sweeping set of progressive goals to drastically cut greenhouse gas emissions, and couple that with other progressive causes, namely universal health care and a federal jobs guarantee for those working in the energy transition.
The US is at a pretty unique place in history right now where we finally have the technological capability, the economics are beginning to line up, where we actually have the potential to truly transform the US electricity system and create a future system that is not only affordable, that is not only reliable, but also is environmentally sustainable, that fundamentally addresses the climate problem that we face, that creates new jobs and local jobs, that supports innovation and local economic development. That's all possible, and it's within our reach.
The renewable future isn't going to just happen at some point magically in the future. It's going to happen because of decisions that we make today and tomorrow and the next day and every day for the next 40 and 50 years. If we do that, if we undertake a strong national commitment and we show strong national ambition, we will get to a clean energy future.